Okay, so we're going to start out with the intro to ecology. If you don't know what the meaning of etymology means, it's just like the origin of the word. So the etymology of ecology just comes from the Greek eco, or from the oikos. This word oikos means home. So ecology is just the study of home. And that was coined in 1866 by this scientist. Ecologists work at all these different levels. So the organismal level, population level, and all these levels, they work together and they interact. So you could never study population without understanding how a specific population operates in the community. You could never study the organisms without understanding the ecosystem in which the organism lives, because all of these influence each other. You have to study everything together, and that's why scientists look at these simultaneously. If you drew one thing out and looked at it, you would get a really skewed idea, and you would have no idea why things were happening the way that they were in that particular level. When they talk about the range and the niche, the range is more like a two-dimensional concept, where it's basically talking about, say, for example, anoles. They can live in a certain climate because of the weather conditions, the precipitation, the temperature. There's a certain area in which they can exist. But a niche talks about, okay, are there resources in that particular area for that anole to thrive? So the conditions might be right, temperature and climate wise, for that anole, but they may not have the food that they need in order to survive. So then they have to move to a different area, maybe up the trees or into grassy regions, in order to find the resources that they need to thrive and survive. So that's why niches are in-dimensional, because there's all these other factors. There's temperature, water, pH, food, O2, all these different aspects play a role in where a species can exist. So because of that, there's more than just two dimensions that affect where a species can reside and live. Let's see, understand that. So I think weather and climate is pretty self-explanatory. Weather is just a short-term condition. So we had rain today, that's weather. Climate is looking at how that fits into a trend over generations. So like with climate change, are the temperatures rising overall over the course of hundreds of years versus what's happening just this year? And these all play a role in biogeography, because organisms depend on temperature and precipitation. Temperature and precipitation determine your climate. So they tell you what climate that region is. So if that temp or precipitation changes at all, the animals and the plants that were able to live there at one point may not be able to live there anymore. So as those two things vary or fluctuate, that's what species then will begin to fluctuate based on those. So that's how climate and weather can affect biogeography. Weather probably wouldn't affect it very much because it's just a short-term change, but those long-term climate changes would change what species can live in a certain area. We'll jump over here. How do physical features of the Earth system operate to determine the climate? So there's all these different things, the way that the sun hits. So we've got the equator right here. It's going to take the most heat from the sun year round, pretty much. It's going to have sun almost all the time. And that a lot of where sun hits the Earth is based on this 23-degree tilt of the Earth. So the way that the Earth tilts, some of these regions up here in the north and way down in the south, they'll never receive direct sunlight at any point. Like Texas will never receive sunlight that's at a 90-degree angle ever in the year. But this, between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, they'll rotate. The sun will hit these different areas at 90 degrees throughout different times of the year. That'll affect it. You'll also have proximity to oceans and mountains. Like there's this region up here in Washington where the weather or the rain will come and hit the mountains, and it'll drop on the west side of the mountains, and all the rain will drop. And so nothing comes to the east side of the mountains, and it's super dry on that side. So those mountains determine how much rainfall the area gets. So that the proximity to the oceans, of course, because the oceans carry rainfall. There's also the gyres in the ocean, these are the circulation, these are your circulation patterns. So the wind, the way the wind moves, the way the ocean currents move, all of that is going to be bringing all these different climate. It influences all these climates because it's, of course, again, climate has to do with temperature and precipitation. So the winds and the oceans can cool or warm areas and bring precipitation or cause it to be dry. So all of that has an effect, but also the chemistry of the atmosphere. And we'll get into that more when we talk about greenhouse effects in a little bit. So I'll actually, these three here are very important when it comes to the greenhouse and heating up the terrestrial biomes. Here, this just talks about, this really shows how the biomes are related. Like I said, climate has to do with your precipitation, which you can see here on the this axis here, and then your temperature on this axis. That's what influences what biome you have. So if you changed precipitation at all, or you changed temperature at all, you'd end up in a different biome altogether. So that's how they relate to each other. They're just related by temperature and precipitation. An anthrome is a biome that's been altered by humans, and pretty much all biomes in the world have been touched by humans. There's almost no place on this planet that hasn't been affected by humans, and we'll kind of see the things humans have done as we get into some of these other stuff. The factors that determine aquatic biomes, this is the important ones, are the depth and the light availability. This is, as you get deeper, less light can penetrate. And so fewer organisms that need light, they can't grow there. And so they can't, because they can't photosynthesize. And so it changes what kind of plants or animals that you're going to have at different depths based on what sunlight can reach them. I'm picking up. Can you guys, here, I'll just mute you all. Okay. I just muted you. I'll just unmute yourself if you need to talk. The next thing is nutrients and organic matter. And this kind of goes back to the, remember we talked about the algal blooms because of the excess amount of nutrients from the nitrogen that ends up in the water. So that's going to affect your aquatic biomes as well. It all depends on how much nutrients are in a particular area of your aquatic zones. And then of course, salinity, think about the different species that are in freshwater versus saltwater areas. So then we talked about behavioral ecology. The first thing you talked about was proximate causes and ultimate causation. So proximate causation is always going to be related to the mechanisms. It explains how an action occurs. It's just basically talking about the mechanics. You move your arm, this happens. That's just talking about the mechanical structure. When they're talking about the ultimate causation, that has to do with fitness. And he's always going to I think he's going to refer back to fitness, I should say it that way, when he talks about ultimate causation. And fitness has to do with, why did this mechanism develop to increase fitness, or how did it increase fitness so that this species survived and became part of this evolutionary process? So it's looking at the broader scale of things, not just this. It's kind of, I guess it's kind of like weather and climate, looking at this momentary picture in time versus how it fits into an overall trend. With learned and innate behaviors, it can be hard to tell. There's like the sliding scale because it can be hard to tell which ones are innate and which ones are learned. Sometimes a behavior looks like it's innate, but it actually was learned somewhere along the way, like walking. Walking isn't technically innate, but we all walk. Well, not all of us. Most of us walk, but that's a learned behavior. Other things like yawning, we all do yawn. So if you look at a species and you see a general trend, like there's a specific action that all the species do, that's most likely an innate behavior. That's a good way to figure out which ones are innate. But again, the line is very blurred. There's not really a way to distinguish some of these between learned and innate. And these can all be, or a lot of these learned behaviors, they can be shared through social networks. And it's not just exclusively human. All these animals, they can teach each other behaviors. So behaviors are seen as trade-offs because you can't really optimize one or optimize both. So he gave the example of reproducing or foraging for food. So if you're reproducing, you're not foraging for food. And if you're foraging for food, you're not reproducing. So you can't maximize both of them. You have to, they're both kind of taking a hit. Both of your behaviors are taking a hit so that you can have both happen. And that's just what he means by trade-offs in behaviors. See. Reciprocity and altruism. Reciprocity is just there's this cooperation based on these repeated interactions. So as species come in contact with each other over time, they develop these cooperations where both species are getting something out of the relationship. So one is giving and the other is receiving, and then vice versa, that they're then giving and receiving. But these, and I think this is kind of an important key, is that it comes from repeated interactions. Altruism is just when there's cooperative activity, but the provider doesn't get anything. It's just the recipient gets all the benefit. And he said, and I think he probably is going to ask this on the test, I think, for some of us, altruism doesn't come about because the species is trying to be nice. It's actually going to come about because of this Hamilton's rule, in a sense, where, so we'll go look at this one. Altruism, and the reason this is kind of they had issues, evolutionary biologists had issues because they were baffled as to why altruism continued on, because it doesn't pass the genes on. So if I as a species am giving, but I can't pass my genes on, say through reproduction, why would my altruism continue on to other descendants? Because it's not being passed. They thought, well, it would be selected against over time. But they found this idea of kin selection, where basically my genes are passed on through my relatives. And so my altruism would be, I would be altruistic to those that are my kin, because I knew that my genes were being passed on through my kin. And that is expressed here through the Hamilton's rule. This is a really important one. Of course, we're going to have to be working out some problems in the test. So RB has to be greater than C in order for this rule to hold true. And he kept saying, think of the inequality sign as an equal sign. And it really is important to think it that way, because if C is 1 and B is 4, then R has to be something so that B stays greater than C. And so you would think, okay, 1 divided by 4 would be 0.25. So something 0.25 or greater, it actually would have to be greater than that, because it's not, and this is kind of going to be something to realize too. This inequality is strictly greater than, it's not greater than or equal to. So it'd have to be something greater than 0.25 to be included. It couldn't be equal to 0.25. I hope that makes sense. The math stuff can be somewhat tricky, but just realize that it always, this side, this left side of the equation always has to be greater than this right side of the equation. So, and then he offered that table in the lecture. Let me see if I can pull it up just so you guys can see for sure, and I don't have to do where pop it up. Where was it? Here we go. Okay. So this table is what you're going to want to refer to in the exam. And so you have 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. So in the one where I said C was 1 and B was 4, you might think, oh, these 0.25s, they work, but they don't, because it has to be greater than. So you'd be looking at all these 0.5s here. They would be the right answer. So let's move on. Hampton. Okay, so eusociality is just where the social system, where some individuals give up reproduction. And that happens, there's these three instances here where reproductive division of labor in a eusocial system. There's overlapping generations where the mother is present with the adult offspring, and there's cooperative care of the young. So you're going to see that in this eusocial system, you're going to see these 3 characteristics. And inclusive fitness has to do with the fact that they're taking into account the fitness of relatives. So it's not just my fitness, it's the fitness of my sisters and my brothers. That factors into inclusive fitness. So then we move on to lecture 18. At lecture 18, population ecology. A population is just a group of individuals all living at the same area at the same time. That's pretty self-explanatory. Metapopulation, I think, is the one that was a little bit more confusing. It has to do with populations that are connected through migration. So you might have like a parent population, and you might have these little offspring populations in different areas, and they would feed into this larger parent population, but they might come and go. And so it's not a stable population. It has these influxes of the same species, but they're not always present. So they migrate in and out of this parent population. And then I think this is pretty self-explanatory. These are the factors that influence population changes over time. The 3 types of life history for organisms, there's type 1, 2, and 3. Type 1, that's the one we fit into, and you can see it's on the left side over here. We have low fecundity, meaning we don't produce a lot of offspring, and we have high survivorship, meaning our offspring tend to survive. Whereas over here in type 2, they have high fecundity, meaning they have a lot of offspring, but low survivorship, so their young don't tend to survive. And then you can see these qualities, those are going to be really important when you're differentiating type 1 and type 3. He said he's not gonna make us differentiate with type 2 because it's hard to decipher where the trend kind of changes. It's kind of more of a sliding scale rather than a bucket system here. So when you're looking at type 3, you're just going to see all these different traits over here. They have to do with this type 3. And then when you're looking at type 1, you're just going to be cognizant of these type of characteristics that characterize type 1. So he's probably going to give some information and say, which type is this? And then you would just look at this chart. If a population grows without density dependence, how would a population grow? So this is an exponential growth. And I don't know if y'all remember that from math, but it's just where a line goes up diagonally without end forever. And there's no cap to it. So if we didn't have anything that constrained us as a species, we would grow forever. There would be no end to it. But that's not really realistic. So we do have density dependence factors do stop us from growing. And the things that limit our population is this list right here. So there's a good list of what is going to limit us. But I think it's pretty self-explanatory. So if density dependence occurs, what additional factors included mathematically and what type of growth is this? So then we have this growth pattern that kind of looks exponential at first, but then it kind of approaches an asymptote and kind of levels out. We hope. That asymptote line is our carrying capacity, or K, and that's the mathematical term. K is the mathematical term that's going to be incorporated into our logistic growth function, because that's what it is. When you're density dependent, it's a logistic growth, and that's how it approaches the asymptote. Now, sometimes species will go above their asymptote, which means that the population, the density of the population has exceeded the carrying capacity. And if it exceeds the carrying capacity, then you're going to have a lot of die-off because there won't be enough resources to feed the population. So if we don't start reducing growth at some point on our own, nature will force us to reduce growth by killing us off because we won't have resources. And again, that's logistic growth. And then here you just want us to understand that humans are subject to that carrying capacity, no matter how egocentric we may be and think that we can provide for ourselves indefinitely. We have a carrying capacity as well. So there'll be a point at which we can no longer support humans on this planet. Supposedly. No, we haven't reached it yet, so who knows? We'll see what happens. Community ecology. So he's began talking about the community. And so remember that community differs from population, and that population talks about one species, whereas community talks about a bunch of different species that are together in a community and they're influencing each other's outcomes. So think of the types of grasses that are eaten by bugs that are then eaten by rodents. That's your community that are all living there together, all these different species. So you have commensalism. This is when one species gains and the other isn't affected at all. This is the least studied one because a lot of times scientists would think that they had found a commensal relationship, and then they would go on to find out it was not, it was parasitic. So they're having trouble locking down, commensal relationships. They tend to be one of the other three in most cases. The next is competition, where it's a negative relationship, meaning that both species are negatively affected because they're both competing for the same resources. So if they weren't competing, then one species would have all the access to that resource and they would be able to thrive. But since they're both competing for that same resource, they're both going to lose out compared to if they were able to live there by themselves. And there's intraspecific competition, which we learned about in lab, right, which is within species, and interspecific is between different types of species. Consumption is a positive-negative relationship because one creature is eating another creature. And so you can see that there's just all these different types with the herbivory, predator, parasite, parasitoid. These are the different types of consumption. And then there's mutualism, where both are benefiting, and so both are getting plus plus. Now, these probably started out as one of the other three, commensalism, competition, or consumption, but over time, evolution forced selection for the species that would thrive in this type of relationship, and then it moved towards being a mutualistic relationship. And I put this slide in here so you can see all the different aspects of the four, because they're important to know, of course. And then competition is some negative, because you can see here it is up here, 2 negatives. No matter how you put them together, they're both going to lose out. So the fitness of both species is reduced. No matter what, they're both going to hurt. But there is, and I'm going to pull up this slide real fast because I want to show you symmetric and asymmetric competition here. That was 19. I'm sorry for my voice too. I'm suffering from allergies with all this weather coming in. Okay, so we have competition. There's 2 types of competition. Where are they? There is symmetric competition here, where both are negatively affected to the same degree, meaning neither one is getting a better benefit. They're both utilizing the same resources equally, and they're both being hurt. But this is your asymmetric competition here. And the reason this is asymmetric is because this purple species out here actually has a larger niche. So it's not being hurt as much as this green species. This green species is being hurt so much that it will go extinct eventually because it can't compete. This species can continue thriving on these extra. So they're eating what the green needs to eat, and they're eating more. So they're going to grow more species, and they're going to be able to thrive, and their fitness is increased more so than the green, and eventually they'll just knock out the green altogether. In other cases, so this is, he asked then about, under what conditions would you predict character displacement to occur? And how does this relate to genetic diversity? So you would see here, this is, and I kind of wrote this in here, but this is the fundamental niche. So this species should be able to consume in all of this, but due to competition, this is the realized niche. This is actually where its niche is. And so as it eats out here and this one eats out here, they'll begin the groups in the middle that are competing will start to die out, and fitness will, and the evolutionary process will push them away from each other. And then you'll have this happen. And so this is your character displacement here. They'll eventually separate from each other, and then they will no longer have competition because they'll just push away from each other. So that's this one. If traits change within the niche, individuals in the niche overlap, die, and don't pass on their genes. And so then their displacement occurs. And so now the populations can coexist because there's no longer that overlap in competition like there was up here. Let's see. And then, of course, how does this relate to genetic diversity? I didn't put that in here, but I'll tell you how it relates. So the more diverse, this here shows that there's a diversity in this population. So let's go back. There's a seed one here. So this species can eat these different sizes of seeds. And so they have some diversity in here. And this one has some diversity too in this species. So this little group in here between the red and the blue that only eats this seed, that genetic trait is going to be selected against because there's too much competition. But this species has enough variation and genetic diversity that it can live on these 2 seeds, so it can begin moving, the curve can move this way. And the same goes for this one because it has enough genetic diversity that it can live on this seed, so this will begin moving that way. Let's see what else we got here. How does consumption lead to the evolution of constitutive defenses, induced defenses, and mimicry? I think that's self-explanatory too. These are this first one is always present. Inducible defenses only comes about in the presence of predators, and mimicry is when one animal that's not dangerous looks like another that is dangerous. But this comes about, evolution causes this to happen because the species, the genetic or the animals that have the genes that don't, say, maybe there's a type of wasp or whatever that's not dangerous and it doesn't have this mimicry. Well, it will be killed off by predators, and the ones that have the mimicry to look like a dangerous hornet will then, that one will thrive and its genes will be passed on to its offspring, and then that mimicry will be selected through natural selection and they will continue on. And so it's that they have greater fitness. Community structure depends on these things. So it depends, of course, we were talking about community being all the different populations of species in an area and how they influence each other. So the community structure would depend on the total number of species that are in the area, how they interact with each other, the relative abundance of all the species present. So how many of each species there is, and then the physical attributes of the environment. So your community structure is based on all of these aspects here. And top down and bottom up, they're actually pretty simple. It's not really a trick question or anything. Top down means that the predators at the top of the food web, they determine what happens below. And bottom up means that the resources at the bottom of the food web determines what happens at the top. That basically means, like, if you think about it, if there's only one grass present and these animals eat on it and then that grass dies, then everything above that grass is affected. And all the way up to your tertiary consumers, they're all affected. So that's your bottom up structure, community structure. And the top down structure, say a new predator is introduced and it begins killing off some of the deer that are eating the grasses at the bottom, and suddenly those grasses begin to thrive. Well, that's been affected from the top down. Understand the two components. And I'm rushing through this, guys, so if you all have questions, please stop me. Understand the two components to diversity. So the two components are richness and evenness. So that's the Shannon index. And let's go look at that real quick. Make sure that we all are really good with the Shannon index, because of course this is going to be on the test for sure. Here we go. Okay, so your species richness down here and your species evenness, those are your two components that affect how diverse a population is. So it doesn't matter if you have 6 different species, that really has nothing to do with it. What you want to look at is this number, and the highest number is going to show you your highest level of diversity. So because community 2 has the highest number, it has the highest diversity. And that has to do with this number, the richness, which is 6, and the evenness, which is high. It's high evenness. Those two come together in this function and they get you the highest number. So no matter what other information he gives you, just look at what species he says has the highest number, and that's going to be your most diverse species. Understand how energy flows through ecosystems. Energy flows through ecosystems via a food web. We always talked about what the food chain, but it's not really a chain, because all these different species come together and a bunch of different animals can eat the same grasses, and a bunch of different carnivores can eat the same animals, and it becomes a complete intertwining web of who eats who throughout this whole thing. But it always starts with the primary producers, or the autotrophs, photosynthesizing. They capture the light, they make it into chemical energy. That's where it begins, and then it moves up from there, from your primary producers to your primary consumers, your secondary consumers, and your tertiary consumers. And then you're going to have your decomposers in there eating whatever the dead stuff is at the bottom. NPP is just the net primary productivity. So I'm going to jump down here to this little picture. Here we go. So here's your net primary productivity. This is what the plants have made down here. And so in this example, they produced 10,000 grams per meter squared per year. So that's the biomass that they produce. This 10% rule says that, sorry, that's the net primary. I'll finish this question. That's the net primary produced. And then you have, this is the, oh my goodness, why can't I think? Gross primary production minus R, which is the cellular respiration, what's lost, the energy that's lost, and that gives you your net. So this equation is what that answers that question. But this is in our food web. So say that we have this 10,000 grams produced here. When your primary consumers consume it, it's cut down to it supports only 100 grams of per meter squared per year of your primary consumers. And then once it jumps to the secondary level, it only supports 10 grams per meter squared per year and of your secondary. And that only supports 1 gram of your tertiary consumers. So everything is cut down as it gets to the top. And then this question talks about biomagnification. If you have a pollutant down here, so think about it, if you had like 10 grams of pollution in there, well, that would almost, your ratio would jump so high. So 10 grams out of 1,000 isn't that big of a deal, but 10 grams out of 100, because that pollution is going to get carried up. And then 10 grams out of 10 grams, and then 10 grams, it's just going to be magnified as you go up into this tertiary consumer. And so he was talking about the DDT and how it destroyed the eagle's eggs, because while it didn't seem to be a big deal at the primary producers, the biomagnification caused it to be compressed and just worse and worse as it got up. And so you were consuming almost, you're consuming so much more DDT up here by the time you're getting up here than these plants were experiencing down here. I hope that makes sense, because biomagnification is rather an interesting thing, because it works with the mercury in fish, and as one fish eats another, because they eat, like small fish get the mercury in them, and they're eating up the food chain, and bigger fish eat them, and that mercury is just compounded as it goes up, so that your biggest fish have the highest concentration of mercury and are the most dangerous to eat. So this one, I think it's just like the food web. Basically, all your nutrients, your carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphate, these are all used to create carbs, lipids, and proteins and nucleic acids. And so they travel up the food web from primary producers. They travel up the food web in the same way that all this other stuff does. So, and this makes the biogeochemical cycles of Earth are that. So this one is a really long question. It has this 1.5 page answers here. Yeah. There are 3 biogeochemical cycles outlined in the literature. The first one is water. And the major pool of water, it comes from the ocean. So it's coming in towards the land here and then coming back down and coming into the aquifers and going back out to the ocean. But this is your major pool for water. And humans have altered this water cycle because they have reduced the capacity. So we basically have taken away the ability of our ecosystems to hold water, because as for forests and stuff and grassland and stuff, they are able to soak in that water and take it down to the aquifers. But when you convert it to ag land, that nutrient, the water can't get through there. It tends to run off more, and so it doesn't recharge the aquifers. And then, so it says these can take hundreds of years to fully recharge, because the water's just running off instead of going back into our freshwater aquifers. Nitrogen, the biggest reservoir is the atmosphere, and that's just from humans who we've really increased nitrogens through like legumes. They have a lot more bacteria that fix nitrogen. So that's a huge deal. And we will also have the nitrogen from the fertilizers. All of this and I put this in there because I think it's all connected. We got all the dead zones and stuff from over too much nitrogen, but all that is put into the atmosphere, and there's just this huge amount of nitrogen floating up there wreaking havoc. And that's humans' role. The last one is carbon, and the largest pool of carbon, it comes from the oceans, with the second largest being the terrestrial biomes. So the largest is going to be the oceans with the carbon in it. Humans have altered this by burning the fossil fuels that were, I mean, fossil fuels have been here for millennia, right? But we're just burning them and releasing them back into the environment, which has not been good. And we've also had this issue with land use change because, again, the same issue up here that's causing the water to run off is the same thing that's causing, because we're taking down our forests and grasslands, which convert carbon back to breathable oxygen. Like, all of this is interconnected, and it's causing problems with the carbon cycle as well. And so I highlighted this because I thought it probably is going to be important. Fossil fuels make up 90% and 10% of land use. This has emerged as the primary drivers of global climate change. So these two issues, and it's kind of funny to me that this land use affects our water and our carbon, and then it's causing the global climate change in a lot of ways. So why does an unusually cool or cold day in the summertime or warm day in the winter not disprove or prove global climate change? Because a lot of those events, like the winter storm that we had, it's called basically a 100-year event. It's like getting a random flood, because we have 100-year floods, right? Every 100 years we have a 100-year flood. It's the cycles that we have, and it doesn't mean that climate change is any different, because we're looking for climate change, we're looking for overall trends, not just for a moment in time. Whereas those storms are still, that's weather, that's looking at a moment in time. But if you look at the overall trend, it's the temperatures are going up. Here's the greenhouse effect. It just has to do with some of these gases that remain in the atmosphere, and they absorb infrared radiation, and they send some of it back to Earth, which causes Earth to heat up. If these gases weren't present, then a lot more of the sunlight would bounce off, and we need some of them. Otherwise, the Earth would be too cold to inhabit. But we've increased these gases, CO2, H2O, and CH4, which is methane. We've increased those so much so that it's sending too much heat back to the Earth. So that's our greenhouse effect right there. And then it just wants you to understand that there's a lot of factors. It's not just humans, but it's all these, the fossil record, the volcanoes, continents, all these things have played a role in changing the climate and affecting the climate. However, we're just doing it faster than all these other things have done it in the past. And then he wanted this. This is the global climate change slide. This is what the Earth may look like, what we're anticipating over the centuries, or over the decades, what the Earth might look like. Okay, last chapter, biodiversity and conservation biology. So there's these are the three components of diversity: genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. Genetic diversity has to do with the alleles, or all the genes, all the alleles. So it's alleles and genes present in a population. And we've been able to look at genetic diversity because we have these new sequencing abilities that we can look at. Okay, so in our entire population, we have this many different genes. And so we can see how genetically diverse a population is. We can look at species diversity. Has to do with at this level. So genetic diversity is more looking at populations, where species diversity is looking at the community. So how many different species are present in that community? How many grasses, how many rodents, how many deer, and so on and so forth. What's the species diversity look like? And then in ecosystem diversity, this is looking at like the food chains. It's basically comparing how many horizontal animal or creatures you have and how many vertical creatures you have. So it's looking at how they all interact in that web. So high genetic diversity equates to capacity to evolve because you have more alleles to select from. There's more chances for mutations. And so the more chances for mutations means that nature can select for more advantageous mutations. But if you have fewer alleles, you have less chance of mutations, and fewer chances of mutations mean you have less chance of selecting for favorable or fit genes that will survive. High species diversity equates to ecosystem stability, resilience. So it has to do with, okay. So again, it's kind of like genetic diversity only in the community. So say you have one kind of grass in the community and you have a couple of different types of herbivores that eat that grass. If that grass dies out, then all those herbivores are affected. But if you have like 5 different species of grasses that those herbivores can eat, if one species of grass dies off, they're not as affected. And so it's more, then your habitat is more stable. It's more able to evolve and not be hurt by one species die off. So the more species you have in an ecosystem, the more likely it's going to survive and thrive the loss of one or more species. And then ecosystems, how does an ecosystem with high diversity result in stable ecosystem functions? Again, it's the same thing. So the more species that you have, the more likely the species are to be resilient and resistant. So when you have this change right here or some kind of disruption, the more species that you have available in the ecosystem, the more likely that you're going to bounce back. You're not going to have really a huge impact and you're going to bounce back more quickly. And this is really important because this is how diversity in pretty much all the levels, all diversity is going to thrive with high resilience and high resistance. And that's when you have a lot of species in the web. How does diversity increase for each of the 3 components? How does it decrease? So diversity increases when you have mutations. So you have in the first level, the genetic, so you go up here and you look at genetic diversity. In genetic diversity, you have mutations, new alleles, new genes, and this increases your diversity. In the species diversity, you have new species coming in and they change everything up. They increase the diversity, the more species that come in. And in the ecosystem diversity, you have environmental changes, so climates, volcanoes, there's all these different things that can happen to make the climate more favorable for new species to move in. And so they help with diversity. So diversity decreases through extinction of alleles, species, or ecosystems. So if you have species dying off or certain alleles not being passed down or the ecosystem is degraded somehow, then you're gonna have a decrease in diversity. Let's see what else we've got here. Okay, so then I've added a few different things in here. As diversity increases, new or modified ecosystem functions arise. So you can have as things change, as the ecosystem changes, of course, you're going to have modifications and different species can survive and different functions can happen. What are the 6 threats to biodiversity? These are the 6 threats minus desertification. That wasn't counted as one of the 6 threats, but it is a threat. It's just when habitat is degraded, when you're overexploiting grasslands or farming and ranching and farming lands, and then you have this desertification happen. This is the last question, guys. What are the 4 broad types of ecosystem services? How do these relate to ecosystem functions? Why might more biodiverse systems maintain? Okay, so this answers the whole question right here. You have these are your 4 different services, and I can't read them because I'm not zoomed in very well. Let's see. So here's your 4 different ones: provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, and supporting services. And then these bullet points underneath, those are the functions that they offer. So here's the service, here's the functions that they offer. So that answers that question. And why might more biodiverse systems maintain ecosystem services more so than less diverse systems? So it goes back to the same thing we were already talking about. The more diverse your system is, the less likely that the system will be affected by one species becoming extinct, because another species will step in and take over the function and be able to do what the extinct species was doing before. So the more diverse system that you have, the more stable it is, the more resilient it is, and the more it's able to bounce back from any degradation or extinctions. That is all. Does anybody have questions? I went through that really fast, I know. Pretty fast, actually. Okay. I'm going to take that as, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'll say no.
Okay.
It was good.
Thank you. Thank you for responding. I was like, I don't know if anybody can still hear me or not. I hope I've been talking for 30 minutes for nothing. Okay, I will be up for a while this evening, and of course I'll be available tomorrow. If you guys have any questions, you can feel free to message me, and I can chat with you about any of this stuff. I know this is the last test, so good luck, you guys. I hope you all do well.